Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, just 13 days out from the election, if you can believe it. And with early voting underway across much of the country, we are tracking the fallout from a stunning on-the-record condemnation of former President Donald Trump by his longest-serving White House chief of staff, retired four-star General John Kelly. Kelly telling the New York Times in a recorded interview that he was deeply troubled by Mr. Trump's comments about using the military against his domestic political rivals, and that, in his view, Donald Trump meets the definition of a fascist.
Looking at the definition of fascism, it's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. He certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
Now, Kelly told the Times that during his tenure at the White House, President Trump wanted personal loyalty over loyalty to the Constitution, and that he expressed contempt for disabled veterans, and that he had even praised Adolf Hitler.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. I said, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason, but he would occasionally say that.
The Trump campaign dismissed Kelly's comments, calling them fabricated, saying that the retired four-star general had, quote, beclowned himself. The Harris campaign today seizing on Kelly's comments as it intensifies its closing arguments that the former president is unfit for office.
This is a window into who Donald Trump really is from the people who know him best. And it is clear from John Kelly's words that Donald Trump is someone who, I quote, certainly falls into the general definition of fascist. Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there to be the guardrails against his propensities and his actions. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want?
As John Kelly said, Donald Trump doesn't understand the Constitution, nor does he respect the rule of law. If there was ever a red line, he has stepped across it.
Meanwhile, the former president is ratcheting up his personal attacks on the Harris-Walz ticket, including last night in battleground North Carolina, baselessly suggesting that Vice President Harris is a substance abuser.
Does she drink? Is she on drugs? I don't know. I have no idea. She's a low IQ individual. Remember, she's a stupid person. She's totally unfit for office. No one respects her. No one trusts her. No one takes her seriously. And something is clearly wrong with her. Something is wrong with her. Something's wrong with her, and something's wrong with this vice president. He is off. She can't put two sentences together. I'm competing against this stupid person.
Now, with the race so close, the big question is, will any of these developments move voters, even a small subsection of voters? Our friend Chuck Todd writes in his column today, ultimately, this campaign is likely to come down to whether Trump's character is problematic enough for some GOP-leaning suburban voters that they hold their noses and support someone they politically would normally not support. We're going to talk to Chuck in just a moment. Vaughn Hillyard, though, is with the Trump campaign in Georgia, and Yamiche Alcindor is following the Harris campaign in Philadelphia. Vaughn, let me start with you and these striking comments from General John Kelly. You've been talking to your sources inside the Trump campaign. What are they telling you? What's the reaction?
This is a candidate in Donald Trump who is really running his campaign strategically and communications-wise, Kristen. And so for his campaign advisors, there is no effort to soften the impact of the criticism of his former chief of staff, John Kelly. Instead, it is to take John Kelly head on. You referenced a statement from the spokesman that suggested that John Kelly was beclowning himself with his statements about Donald Trump. But you see from the candidate himself, who we are now just seeing for the first time here today at an event down the road not far from where we are in Georgia, somebody who has a history of lashing out against his former administration officials who had spoken out against him. James Mattis, his former Pentagon secretary, said that Donald Trump wanted to divide Americans instead of unite. You had the likes of another defense secretary, Mark Esper, speak out against him. H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor. You have Rex Tillerson, his former secretary of state, his former national security advisor, John Bolton. Really, though, what John Kelly's words, though, is really for the first time you hear directly from somebody that worked so closely with him, calling him an authoritarian. And I want to let you listen because I mentioned for Trump and his campaign, this is about responding and making these individuals a part of the campaign. Take a listen to Donald Trump on the campaign stage last night in Greensboro, North Carolina.
When Putin saw how weak we were, how pathetic we were, with the stupid Milley and these generals that aren't even generals as far as I was concerned, what a stupid group of people they were. Mattis, Milley. We have a great military, and they're not woke. Some of the stupid people up top are woke.
We have seen Donald Trump speak out against those who have criticized him by suggesting, oh, but they are the ones that encumbered him from being an even more successful first president, and that he, come 2025, will ensure that he is surrounded by campaign advisors and cabinet members who are duly efficient or duly loyal to him and carry out the wishes of the Republican Party and the MAGA agenda. So for Donald Trump, this is really a moment here where he is taking some criticism head on, at the same time using that criticism to try to galvanize his most faithful supporters to put him back in the White House.
And Vaughn, as you've been speaking, former President Trump is talking there in Zebulon, Georgia, where you are. Talk about the strategy in Georgia, a place where Trump clearly now feels he's on a bit of defense. What have we heard from him today?
Right. These are the 7 battleground states that you're looking at, and polling shows them close everywhere. Georgia, North Carolina, where he spent the last 2 days, are really 2 of those states that he needs to win. If he does not effectively win these 2 states, it's going to be tough for him to get to 270 electoral college maps on November 5th. But for him, again, when we're talking about, Kristen, about the type of leader that he wants to be, part of that message is making the case that he and the use of the executive branch could be more effective than relying on Congress. Mitch may have a Democratic majority, for example, in the House. When we're talking about immigration, for example, we have heard him talk so much about immigration and pushing back against the criticism that he helped stymie and bring an end to that bipartisan bill up on Capitol Hill earlier this year. He has gone around the country telling crowds, including just this week, that you don't need a bill, you need a president. And for Donald Trump, that means him. And the suggestion is that the White House, and particularly one who is effectively able to use the power of the White House, is the answer to so many of America's problems. That's coming from Donald Trump. Kristen.
All right, Vaughn Hillyard in Georgia for us. Key battleground state. Vaughn, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Yamiche, let's head over to you in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Obviously, the biggest battleground, 19 electoral votes. So the candidates will be barnstorming this state between now and Election Day. Talk about the strategy in the wake of these John Kelly comments, because they really fit into what we've heard from the vice president, these closing arguments, quite frankly, that she's been making, which have revolved around trying to make this argument that we heard when President Biden was at the top of the ticket, that Trump is a threat to democracy. And it's striking because obviously reproductive rights, Democrats know that's something that energizes their base. But she's really putting the focus on this idea by John Kelly and more broadly speaking that Trump is a threat.
That's right, Kristen. The vice president and her entire campaign are really seizing on these comments by former Chief of Staff John Kelly, and really wanting to underscore that what he's saying about the fact that former President Trump fits into the category of a fascist, that really is just connected to their overall messaging and the thesis that they've been making that's been part of their campaign, which is that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. So we saw the vice president do something that she's rarely done, which is deliver remarks and really talk about the fact that not only is this problematic and dangerous language when you hear this from people who know Donald Trump best, but she also made the point that if Donald Trump were to be reelected, he wouldn't have people like John Kelly back in the White House with him. So in other words, he would be, in her mind and in her words, more unhinged, and he could use the military to do all sorts of things that would be going against the U.S. Constitution. We've also heard Governor Tim Walz talk about this. He says, as a 24-year military veteran, these comments and this idea of Donald Trump comparing himself and wanting Adolf Hitler's generals to be like the generals of the United States, that makes him, quote, sick. So they are really, really leaning in on this, and we expect to hear the vice president and her running mate and a number of campaign surrogates continue to talk about this, Kristen.
Meanwhile, Yamiche, our friend and colleague Hallie Jackson, sat down with the vice president yesterday. They covered a range of different topics. What were your key takeaways?
They did cover a range of topics. I think one of the top takeaways from this interview was that the vice president says that any sort of negotiation that impacts women's abilities to really have control over their own bodies when it comes to the issue of abortion is a non-negotiable. Take a listen to a moment where they were talking about that topic.
So is a question of pragmatism then, what concessions would be on the table? Religious exemptions, for example, is that something that you would consider?
I don't think we should be making concessions when we're talking about a fundamental freedom to make decisions about your own body.
To Republicans like, for example, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, who would back something like this on a Democratic agenda if, in fact, Republicans control Congress, would you offer them an olive branch, or is that off the table? Is that not an option for you?
I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals because we can go on with a variety of scenarios.
Another interesting moment from that interview was that Vice President Harris said she thinks that the country is ready for a woman of color herself to be president, a topic that she has not wanted to engage in, like in a big way, but a topic that she was very comfortable talking about in this interview, Kristen.
Yeah, very different strategy than we saw with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, for example. Yamiche, thank you so much. Joining me now on set is NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd, Betsy Woodruff Swann, national political correspondent for Politico, Faiz Shakir, senior advisor to Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Thanks for being here. Betsy, let's start with these comments by John Kelly, obviously getting a lot of attention, but the big question is, are they going to move the needle? Are they going to bring anyone into the Harris category? I want to play a little bit more of them and get your reaction on the other side.
He's certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about and what makes America America in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values, the way we look at everything, to include family and government. And he's certainly the only president that I know of that was certainly in my lifetime that was like that.
What do you think the impact's going to be?
I don't think it's going to be as helpful to the Harris campaign as she and her team are banking on. There's no question that they see this as an enormous political boon, that it's something the vice president wants to talk about in her town hall tonight, that it's a theme she's been leaning into so hard in these key final days of the campaign. At the same time, though, it's very much of a piece with what so many former Trump White House officials have been saying for 3 years now. The fact that his closest advisors, including his closest national security advisors, have said he's a danger, he engages in this type of disturbing activity and rhetoric. These allegations are part of a long-running theme, and they're not part of a theme that has resulted in making this race clean-cut and easy for the Harris team.
Yeah, Chuck, do you think that John Kelly speaking out encourages other Trump officials to speak out? And could that be something that moves the needle when we're talking about the inches of this race?
Well, what's interesting, and I want to piggyback on something that Betsy just said, is I think we need to step back and realize how strategic the Harris campaign has been today just about this topic. If you had any doubts about how they were going to close, there should be no doubts. Right. If you have any doubts about what the theme of her speech is going to be on the National Mall, I think I know. We just heard a preview of it. They've decided to close on this match. There's two ways to look at it. It's the one voter that's left that she can get. This is an incredibly hard voter to get. But you have to work at it, work at it. This is a Republican voter who probably has voted for Trump once or twice.
Right.
And you've got to get them to do something that perhaps they've never done before. And not only that, Harris might be more liberal than any Democrat that they have ever encountered. And they're likely, I mean, here, let me give you an example. State of Pennsylvania. Bob Casey is trying to win over a Trump voter to win.
Right.
And now she's basically trying to win over a McCormick voter in the suburbs of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is because and this is true of both sides, the closing messages for the Democrats down the ballot, Social Security, very curious what my man Faiz is about to say.
You're taking my line.
I know, but it's fascinating to me, and I have no doubt there is a lot of already what I'd say the pre-Monday, we're Friday morning quarterbacking.
Right.
If there's Monday morning quarterbackings after the election, this is the, wait a minute, are you sure you want to start this quarterback? Right. We're Friday morning quarterbacking here. But it is interesting to me that the Democratic messages down the ballot are all substance, all
reproductive rights,
mostly two issues. Well, Social Security is the other one that actually has been bigger. I could tell Faiz has been involved. But but look, whatever we think, we know what they think.
Yeah.
And the Harris campaign is banking on something. But by the way, Trump is also banking on a voter that never shows up, a young male.
Right.
Okay, so it is interesting to me that both of them, in this, I sort of now say we're about to crash land. This is not an election that's going to be clean. It's a crash landing, and we're going to have to go through the wreckage to figure out who survived.
Yeah, well, it's a great point, and Faiz, pick up on it, because do you think this is her strongest closing argument? I mean, as Chuck says, the down ballot candidates are talking about Social Security, are talking about reproductive rights, which we have seen in the midterms energizes voters, Democrats, to get out and cast their ballots.
I'm not in love with it, but it's revelatory in terms of the closing argument. To add on to everything that Betsy and Chuck have said, the reason why you might want to emphasize Trump as a fear is because you worry that the 81 million votes that were there for Joe Biden are not yet there for Kamala Harris. And what helps generate that turnout? It's fear of Donald Trump. He might be back. He might be a chaos agent. He's that close in the final days. So I think as much as you're also talking to the Republican voter that Chuck has mentioned, you're also just trying to generate enthusiasm and excitement to get out.
So you think this talks to the base too?
Yes, for sure. Oh, for sure. For sure. I would say it does more for the base than it does
even more
for
than reproductive rights?
I mean, what it does with this argument, they've decided with the Liz Cheney and appeal is that for people like Doug, who are not always in love with Donald Trump, this might appeal to them. My argument, and I feel like the down ballots show this. So if you're Sherrod Brown, Debbie Baldwin, Bob Casey, you look at Dan Osborne's race in Nebraska, you look at Ruben Gallego in Arizona, what are they doing? They are fighting on issues of corporate greed, prescription drugs, Social Security, reducing cost of housing. I want to tackle substantive issues to improve your economic lives. And for that reason, I have much more confidence in where they're going to land at the end of the day than I have right now about Harris.
Yeah, I think his point is ultimately they're talking about what voters are talking about.
Yeah.
And look, how many times have we had Donald Trump bombshells that never amounted to anything, really? You know, this is not an October surprise because no one's surprised. We've heard some of this already.
Is there anything that we could learn about Donald Trump?
No.
I mean, Bill Simmons has the Tyson zone. I think it's a Trump zone. I mean,
absolutely.
What leaked audio of Donald Trump? Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Hey, look, it was 8 years and 2 weeks ago where the Access Hollywood tape came out on a Friday night, and I said, this election's over. The next day I was in Raleigh. I was in Raleigh at an election we didn't know. Right? I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina at a Richard Burr event, and I said, oh wait, no, they're not leaving him. And that's not changed. And yet we see down ballot candidates talking about the issues that voters are talking about. Harris seems to want to stay away from those, and I cannot fathom this.
Let me read a little bit more of what Chuck had to say in your column. The simple fact, this is still a jump ball, is a reminder that Trump is his own worst enemy. And if the final 2 weeks of this campaign are more about Trump than Harris, and you believe we are living in an era when the final decisive voters are more concerned with whom they don't want in the White House than whom they do, then Harris may close stronger at the end than Trump. Chuck.
It is, like I said, I get their theory. I think it's her only path to victory. It's a treacherous path.
So you think it's a narrow path?
It's a narrow
to say
path.
the least.
But you start to look at these intangibles. He's going after a voter. Again, I always laugh at this. Like, he does really well with voters who didn't vote in 18, 20, and 22.
Right.
Okay. They didn't vote in 18, 20, or 22. The likelihood that they're going to vote in 24. Like, how he's connected with young men, he hasn't said what he's going to do for them.
Right.
He just simply says, hey, my lunch table's cooler than her lunch table.
And yet,
don't you want to hang out here? And then you're like, okay. And I've seen young men go, oh, he's funny. But it hasn't translated to a vote yet.
And the question is, will it? But so much of the focus has been on energizing young male and male voters, African-American male voters. Betsy, that's where a lot, I mean, women voters as well, obviously, but a real focus on that from both campaigns.
Yeah, no question. And it's clear, of course, that if Trump is able to peel off just a point or two in terms of Harris's African-American support, you lose states, you lose congressional districts, you lose the makeup of the House of Representatives. It's existential for Democrats that they just do really, really well with that voting bloc. Yeah. Of course, what I find striking is the issues where Harris is willing to compromise versus the issues where she's not. And some of this gets back to these former Republican voters. She's walked back where she stands on fracking compared to 2019. She's walked back some of the very progressive policy stances that she took in that primary. Where she's not compromising, where she won't give an inch, is on these reproductive rights issues. Even when Heye, of course, posed it as a religious exemption issue. Very much Heye asking a question where Liz Cheney would have wanted to hear one answer, and it was not the answer that Harris gave. Yeah. And that, of course, is a position that's appealing very much to voters where reproductive rights is the top issue, and they don't want to see any compromise.
Yeah,
she was one of her strengths was going to be the change agent. And if you look at how it played out after Project 2025, the Democrats did a great job of making sure everyone knew about Project 2025 and hated it, and then kind of moved off of that. And in that period of time, what Donald Trump has done no tax on Social Security, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on car loans, no tax if you're active duty something. Every day he is pulling policy out of his ear and saying something. He's going to go to McDonald's, he's going to talk to working class people, he's going to show up at a Steelers game, he's going to go on some podcast and tell you about how he cares about the direction of this economy. And on the Harris side, you have sensed much more cautiousness. Yeah. If I had to ask you in the last 1 month or 2 months, what new policy have you heard? I would say it's Medicare home care, right? That Medicare rollout. Social Security, how do you get defeat on Social Security? He's now got a no tax on Social Security, in which to most people sounds like a benefit ad. How do you get cut? How do you get beat on that?
Doug, to that point, the race is tied if you look at the polls. And it feels like, I was in Pennsylvania yesterday, it feels like Trump's got a lot of momentum.
You're like the weather person.
But again,
here's the temperature, but the feels like temperature. And I'm always like, just tell me what it feels like. You can make two different numbers. I'm kidding. But this is very good weather forecasting. Yes.
I think one of the reasons for that
have right now
is we also see that people are voting already. And when I look at the North Carolina numbers, my home state, what we see is Republican numbers are up, not massively, but they're up. Democratic numbers are way down in North Carolina, and that is very surprising because that's what they tend to do best. It also tells me whatever happens when we look at the wreckage after the race, voters are safe and secure. They feel that the vote is safe and secure, regardless of what happens after the election.
Here's the other number, of course, that's really fascinating is Nevada, where we're seeing Republicans do much better than anyone expected. And it's especially striking, given that pretty much all the reporting indicates the Nevada Republican Party is a huge mess. Yeah. Just a mess.
And but I'll be honest, on early vote, I take all of those anecdotes and throw them away.
I usually do too.
No, but I would. But here's why I would throw them all away.
We're seeing Republicans in the wake of Trump.
Here's what I promise.
Fraud.
I promise you this fact. There'll be more Democrats that vote on Election Day than did in 2020, and there's going to be more Republicans that vote early than they did in 2020. This is comparing blueberries to apples. Yeah. Okay. If you gave me comparisons to 16, I might be curious. Yeah. But I think 2020 is such an outlier in how...
Yes, because of COVID.
There's a lot of people who are Election Day voters who are also rank-and-file Democrats who prefer to vote on Election Day. Yeah. And they didn't because they trusted their government and were worried about health. But they're going to go back. So, look, it's interesting. Both parties have always different stasis in the last 2 weeks. Republicans are usually confident to overconfident, and Democrats are usually like a friend of mine emailed me. He goes, "I'm not a bedwetter, but after reading this poll, I really have to pee." It's like, okay, we know who you are. So there is a little bit of and that's why I take all these early votes, and I literally just they're as worthy as the garbage.
Faiz, what about you? Do you take them? For lack of a better term, are you getting the sense that people are starting
to pee?
I agree with Chuck. We're very early, and you take the numbers against 2020, and you're like, well, last time the Republicans actively urged people not to vote early, not to vote early.
Yeah.
And this was during COVID, in which we expanded the accessibility of voting. And so Democrats were taking advantage of it. We're more COVID conscious. So the numbers, the apples, they don't work. And so, yes, I believe there is so much time left in the early vote. I take all of this with a grain of salt.
Just very quickly, though, do you think Harris, if she wants to regain the momentum in these final days, does she need to put more meat on the bones of some of these policies? Chuck talked about what we're anticipating from her closing argument next week, based on what we heard today. But what does she need to say to voters? Clearly, this is what a Harris administration would look like versus Joe Biden.
In 2020, I thought Biden did a fine job of making it clear that it was an all-of-the-above candidacy, from all the way Manchin to Bernie to everything in between.
But Trump was in power. It was a fire campaign.
Yeah.
It was a fire campaign.
But you were able to make the clear the coalition believes in my direction. And I do think that now you've gotten a push, right, from Liz Cheney, like, we need to get the Republican, soft Republican votes here. And you haven't seen, standing with, you know, you name your progressives, but it's not that part.
She sent Bernie and Biden up to New Hampshire. That seemed worthy.
Very quickly, because I'm getting a wrap, is Liz Cheney making a difference? Very quickly.
I don't know, but I'll tell you a comment that would have been stronger from her, and I'm curious what you think of this. What if she had said, I hope this is the last time I have to vote for you? And not being an insult, but I think for her to be more effective to get Republicans, I think the case you have to make to Doug Heye is good. Look, this is a one-time vote so we can get the Conservative Party back.
Doug?
I think she needs to finish the sale.
Does she need to tailor her message?
I think that's right. And ultimately, it's much like with the story that, Unleashed today. These are bombshell things that we all talk about. Your average voter just isn't focused on that. And your average Republican voter, not even average, Republican voters, very small sliver.
And remember who's left. The people who are left are the least engaged voters because they've waited till now to decide. They're like, because they've they're the ones that said, I don't want to hear it. They tuned us out. They're the ones that turned it off.
That's right.
So they're going to be less engaged by they wanted to be, and now here we are.
All right, guys, amazing conversation. Thanks for starting us off strong today. Chuck, Betsy, Faiz, and Doug, really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.